Your podcast needs to be everywhere, or at least in as many places as it can be.
And now, a look at this week in podcasting news. It's the Jag Show Podcast.
In 2007, I was working for a radio station in Vermont where, fun fact, billboards are illegal. I was trying to convince my boss that the station needed a page on this new thing called Facebook. Ben, I asked him, if you could have a billboard in South Burlington on Interstate 89 with your morning show's faces on it, would you do it? Well, of course, he said. I said, that's why we need to be on Facebook. We need to be where our listeners are. 14 years later, the same is true of podcasts. Be everywhere your listeners are so more people can find you. I told you last week about Tom Webster of Edison Research talking about YouTube at Podcast Movement. Among weekly podcast listeners, 18% said YouTube is their primary destination for listening to shows, behind only Spotify and Apple. Do you really want to miss out on nearly 1 in 5 weekly podcast listeners? Also, Apple is still having issues. Yes, the recent iOS update was supposed to fix the bug that was stopping downloads, but according to Pod News, many creators still aren't seeing new episodes pop up in Apple Podcasts a full 72 hours after submission. If your show's only on Apple and this happens to you, why bother to even publish the show? It's a tree falling in the woods. Yes, you need to be on the holy trinity of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. But you should also be on YouTube. While you're at it, it wouldn't be the worst idea to submit your show to Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, Pandora, Amazon, and more. None of these services represent even 2% of podcast listening. But why not take a few minutes to connect them to your host's RSS feed? Make sure your content gets everywhere that your potential listeners are. You set it up once, and you're good. Once you are on many different platforms, there are ways to share one link on social media and let your listener pick their app of choice. There's a great guide from Pod News on how to do this, linked in today's show notes. On to other podcasting news from the week. I mentioned last week the importance of SEO and show notes. Google search is still one of the key methods of podcast discovery, and there's a seminar that next Saturday, August 28th, on writing show notes. I got an affiliate link for that in the show notes to this week's episode. iHeartRadio now has a partnership with the TuneIn app that'll create better reach for their radio stations and podcasts. Also, while smart speakers aren't a huge chunk of podcast listening, they are growing. And out of the box, Alexa defaults to TuneIn when you ask it to play a radio station. Sorry if I just triggered your device. iHeart is also teaming up with France's NRJ Group to translate some of its biggest shows into French, starting, of course, with Stuff You Should Know. Podcasts are getting bigger worldwide. The fine folks at Podcast Movement have launched Podcast Movement University, currently free to join, has a bunch of classes you can watch. And if you weren't able to make it to Podcast Movement in Nashville, they've got a highlight video up on YouTube. Quickly, 2 technical items. Audio-Technica has released their new AT2040 microphone. It's about $100. Good news is it's a hypercardioid dynamic microphone, which in English means it's designed to pick up your voice and very little background noise. Bad news, it's only got an XLR connection, so if you want to use it into your computer, you got to have an interface to connect your XLR to USB into your PC or your Mac. If you're a Windows user, you're looking to start editing, but you don't want to spend money on software just yet, the Windows Club has a guide to free Windows audio editing apps. They include Audacity, WaveShop, Sound Editor, and Joe Kosher. Kosher, huh? And finally, my man crush is getting his own podcast. NFL GOAT Tom Brady will be teaming up with Larry Fitzgerald for a weekly show on SiriusXM called, what else? Let's Go, starting in September. It'll air live Mondays at 6 on SiriusXM's Mad Dog Radio, Channel 82, and it'll be repurposed as a podcast after each episode. As always, stay healthy and stay safe. And quickly, if you want to get this podcast as a newsletter in your email box every week and not rely on social media algorithms to get my content, just go to jagindetroit.com/subscribe. Link also in today's show notes. Later.
If you like what you just heard, share The Jag Show with someone else who's interested in podcasts. You can also follow The Jag Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Visit jagindetroit.com.